Good morning. My name is Lance French, Business Development Manager for Braun Intertech Environmental Division, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on environmental considerations for financing affordable housing developments. Our experts for today are Stephen Jason and Derek Schilling. Guys, thanks for joining us today. They're there, I promise. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have questions, please send them to me through your chat tab on your GoToWebinar window. If we don't get to your question, I will make sure they see the question and get an answer to you as soon as possible. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available to rewatch on our website soon, along with the slides, and we will send you an email with a link when they're made available. So let's get to it. So I want to introduce our speakers today. Derek Schilling is a project manager, and he's an account manager, senior scientist, and he is based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Derek has a BA in geology and specializes in environmental development, due diligence, and brownfield redevelopment. He has 19 years of environmental consulting experience. So, Derek, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Lance.
And we didn't say anything. Baseball starts today, so are you a Twins fan? Are you pulling for the Twins, or are you a secret Cubs fan, or what's going on with that?
Twins fan when they're doing well, I guess. No.
Well,
oh yeah, Twins. So been in Minnesota all my life, so yeah, Twins fan.
And Stephen Jason is also a project geologist. He has a BA and MS in geology and specializes in environmental due diligence and brownfield development as well, and has 34 years of environmental consulting experience. So, Stephen, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, good morning, Lance. Thanks.
Okay, so Derek, why don't you give us an overview on what we're going to be talking about today?
Sounds good. Thanks, Lance. So, welcome everybody to the webinar. Happy Thursday. So you need to complete a phase 1 environmental site assessment for your affordable housing development project, your substantial rehabilitation, or are you applying for tax credits? So the point of today's webinar is to provide an overview of the financing-driven environmental assessment requirements for affordable housing projects. Knowing those financing requirements up front will result in completing an appropriate assessment as well to help minimize delays and lower hurdles for your project. So what we're going to talk about today, as you can see, is we're going to start with going over a brief overview of what's included in a standard phase 1 environmental site assessment. And then we're going to talk about the additional requirements that may be triggered by the housing finance agencies, whether at federal or state level, that you may be working with on your project. For example, we've listed a few here as examples: HUD, the Texas Department of Housing Community Affairs, or TDHCA, the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, or the Georgia DCA, and then the Arizona Department of Housing. And then we'll finish that up with going through some case studies of some projects, kind of highlighting these different requirements that were triggered by the referenced agencies. So with that, we'll get to it. Just kind of a quick, high level of what the phase 1 is. A phase 1 environmental site assessment is completed to identify recognized environmental conditions or other issues that may pose an environmental risk to a potential property purchaser. Completion of the phase 1 provides protection from CERCLA, or federal Superfund liability, through what's called the innocent landowner defense for an individual or entity purchasing a property. So that's kind of, a broad definition of a phase 1 environmental site assessment. And the standard phase 1 ESA is going to include what you see listed here. It's going to include a review of readily available historical information and regulatory information. So looking back at a property's use back to its first developed use, and that's through a number of different sources, whether it's aerial photographs, historical maps, fire insurance maps, and so on. And then the regulatory information is a review of all government, whether it's federal, state, or local regulatory databases, to determine if there's been any potential releases, spills, or any actions by a regulatory agency from an environmental perspective, followed by a site visit or a site reconnaissance of the property to kind of identify visually what's there on the property that could be of environmental concern. And then interviews with property owners, local officials such as building permit officials, code officials, or like fire marshals, to just get a better sense of what's happened at the property. And then wrapping that all up into a report that documents all those issues, and then concluding whether or not there's any conditions or issues that may pose an environmental risk, and then providing recommendations if necessary for any additional testing or investigation that may be warranted. We'll touch on some business risk items that may also be included in a standard phase one, such as asbestos, lead paint, and radon, so on. But we'll touch on those a little bit later. So, but what else? So what else would you need to consider in addition to a standard phase one? Applying for financing for an affordable housing project can be much more complicated than just what we talked about. So you have wetlands, cultural and historical resources, and noise. These are things that can derail or delay your financing if not identified early in the process. But what about floodplains, explosive and flammable substances, or endangered species? If a site is developed, you may have asbestos, radon, lead-based paint, and/or mold or moisture issues to address. Important to point out that identifying your financing structure, the parties involved, and knowing their environmental requirements are some of the keys to assessing and scoping the appropriate environmental assessment activities. So what we'll do here in the following slides is I want to touch on some of these additional items and what kind of high level, what they all mean, and also provide some level of time frame that it takes to include these in your assessment. So we'll start with wetlands. Generally, what this starts with is a review of what is the online mapping site from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called the National Wetlands Inventory, and I have an example there on the slide. That basically it's a review of these called the NWI site, and for any potential wetland-related features. Now, it's important to note that this is not a definitive identification of actual wetlands. What this is usually it's basically an aerial review of features that could be wetland or wetland-related features, and so that's what's put on this NWI site. So based on that, that may trigger a full wetland delineation that would be done to confirm if those features are indeed wetland-related features. So then, determination of whether or not the wetlands exist on the property includes the identification and marking of potential feature boundaries, and looking at the plant life and the features to determine if they actually are wetland features or if they're upland, which would not be non-wetland. More importantly, it's demonstrating whether the wetlands on a property are subject to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers jurisdiction, and whether or not then a permit would be required for development or construction work that may affect those wetlands. For projects that impact the wetlands, where the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has jurisdiction or considered waters of the U.S., you'll need appropriate permits to allow the work to be completed within compliance of those federal and potentially even state laws. And then let's say you do identify some wetlands, and then your project is such that it may impact the wetlands, and now your project requires mitigation of those wetland impacts. Or that could include acquisition of or purchasing of wetland mitigation bank credits, or designing new or restored wetland features on your site as part of your development project to kind of offset that, I guess, reduction in wetlands that your initial project may take into account. So what I want to conclude is that, the initial delineation could take 2 or 3 weeks to be completed, to get the delineation done, to get a report issued. But then the jurisdictional determination requires submitting the delineation to the Army Corps and requesting they review and determine if it is a water of the U.S. That process alone could take 30+ days to get a response from the Army Corps. Then if you have to go into permitting for any impact to the wetland or purchasing of mitigation credits, that could even add even more time. So again, kind of stressing on the importance of understanding who's involved and what's going to be required as part of your due diligence will be important to kind of getting this fit into your due diligence period. I also want to note that the presence of wetlands may trigger completion of what's called a 8-step process by HUD, and that's generally if HUD's involved. We'll discuss that a bit later in one of the case studies, what's all included in the 8-step process.
Hey, Derek, I have a question.
Yeah.
So how does it start off when does like a developer saying, hey, I want to put some affordable housing developments in this particular site, and then start the process over, or do certain cities or municipalities actually have a designated area that they want those affordable houses? How does that work? Or so is there restrictions, like if I'm a developer and I come in and it's like I want to put it here, the cities could say, you know what, that's butted up against a wetlands, and so it's automatically denied? Or how does that process start?
I don't think it's automatically denied. I think it has to do with a combination of factors. You have, developers are looking for properties and looking for the areas where affordable housing, there's a need for affordable housing, where cities may be looking for a need. I mean, it's something where I think even just in my community alone, I was looking through city council minutes, and they actually had a developer looking at a site that was actually zoned industrial, but the city thought it was a good idea with the need for affordable housing to potentially look in and put a zone change to make it, zone for residential, or, to be allow that. So, I think from there it starts with, is this a good location for a developer to put affordable housing, from probably a number of standpoints, whether it's, is there a need? Is it supported by the city and the local community? And then they look at the site, and then part of that, you just do a diligence, especially, is to kind of look for these potential features. And then if you do have these, that's where it's going to trigger this additional work to fully understand what the impact might be.
Yeah, I didn't know if,
I guess, yeah,
city walked in there and says, hey, we need affordable housing, and this would be a great area. We would really like to do that. If they would clear up some of this red tape before this happened, but probably not, right?
No, I think, sometimes the cities can give their take, and they maybe will be willing to work with some of the issues on a site, but, that's where we get into kind of, everybody has their own requirements, and even though a city might be willing to help a developer work through some of these issues, they would still, depending on the agency involved, for instance, HUD, they may still say you still need to do your due diligence to understand this before you go ahead and just bulldoze it, basically, or change what's on site. So multiple parties can kind of have their own boxes to check before they're allowed, before things can get to shovels in the ground. So
good, thanks.
So next on that list, so cultural and historical resources. So what that includes is, it's looking at a historic property, which could mean any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, object, or traditional property or landscape that is included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places, which is maintained by the Secretary of the Interior on the federal level. And so an assessment for this is going to look to identify and assess any effects to these historic properties or archaeological sites from a proposed project. And this also includes documenting the effect the proposed project will have on a historic resource or archaeological site that is listed or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. So this will include basically a site visit, as well as document review to determine, is there anything of historical or archaeological significance on a property or adjoining that could be impacted. So whether for new construction, rehabilitation, financing, or conversion from non-residential to residential, will require a determination that one, no historic properties are affected, two, that there will be no adverse effect on those resources, or three, that what is the adverse effect upon those properties, and or those features, and how can you remedy it? I want to point out that, if the evaluation requires a full Section 106 review from the Federal National Park Service, or from the equivalent from the State's Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, that this review could take 60 days, if not longer. It just depends on what ends up happening or what the impact may be. Like I said, if the federal 106 review is not required, a state level review may still be necessary. And again, the assessment itself and documenting what's there and what the impact could be, that potentially is a 3 to 4 week process. And then if you add on any federal or SHPO state SHPO office review, you know, you're adding time to your project. And so again, stressing the importance of understanding who's involved up front will be important. Next, let's talk about noise. Basically, this is evaluating impact to noise on the property, because obviously if we're building affordable housing, we have people living there, and that's, you know, not the best thing to be having a ton of noise. You know, there's two levels of evaluation that are involved with when we evaluate noise for affordable housing projects. It starts with the noise assessment, which is basically a review of the property and proposed development plan and in related to noise sources surrounding the area. So that could be anywhere from a busy freeway to railroad tracks to, as you can see on the picture, as a local airport. And then depending on the airport too, there's different search distances that we have to look at, whether it's an international airport, a local city airport or county airport, or like a military airport. So you look at those from a line of sight, distance from that feature that generates the noise to your closest building, planned building, or site feature that you're going to be developing. But then also looking at, for instance, from highway noise, you're looking at traffic counts, type of traffic, when is it heaviest, when is the noise heaviest, and so preparing an assessment that says this is the expected noise level from these various sources. And based on, a lot of this is based on HUD's criteria. They have set levels of noise that are considered acceptable, normally unacceptable, and unacceptable. And so the assessment helps you understand where you fall in that standpoint. So if you are in the normally unacceptable or above, that's going to trigger what's called an attenuation study. And the attenuation study looks at how does noise attenuate from the outside that's coming on the site to the inside of your proposed building or your existing building, to make sure that you have the appropriate construction materials, whether windows or wall construction, that's going to attenuate that noise to make it within acceptable ranges inside the building. This may also help determine, or may also determine, where you can put outdoor amenities based on the noise levels and where that attenuation factor falls on your site. It's important to do this early in the due diligence, and especially for new construction, complete it prior to site plan being finalized, because depending on noise levels, that could affect the site plan and layout, including where you have your outdoor amenities. So as we talked about the attenuation study, again, to demonstrate that the expected levels inside the planned building, or what the expected noise levels inside the planned building are based on the construction details, to make sure that even though it may be high on the outside, the residents aren't going to have elevated noise on the inside. This could be also something that needs to be considered for existing properties that you're acquiring, just to make sure that the buildings themselves don't need upgraded or new windows or new things like that to address that change in noise. So again, potentially a couple of weeks to do each of these studies, and that assuming how, you know, depending on how far along your construction plans are, because obviously the attenuation study needs to have construction plans to show the wall construction detail as well as the type of windows that are being planned for the site.
Derek, I was just going to ask the question for these typical noise assessments. Are you doing any actual on-site testing, or is it all more calculation source data based?
That's a good question, Steve. So the noise assessment and attenuation study are all done based on a desktop review of features, you know, site maps, looking at that. There is generally no on-site testing done with the noise assessment or attenuation studies. It's all desktop calculation based to determine distance from a feature and reviewing building specifications to determine what that attenuation is across the construction material. All right. Let's see, advance my slide. Next on the list, just want to touch on our floodplains, floodways, and high hazard coastal areas. So the question here is your site within a floodplain, a floodway, or a high hazard coastal area? And if so, what zone and how will it affect the property? If any part of your site or integral offsite development, which includes like ingress or egress and or parking, is located within the 100-year floodplain, which is defined as a 1% chance of annual flood, or also known as a special flood hazard area, or within a 500-year floodplain, which is defined as a 0.2% chance of an annual flood. So for then critical actions would be, you'd have to, according to the best available data, determine if your project then may need to comply with flood plan management regulations, as far as, you know, could mean changing features, adding, you know, levees, dikes, or something that could help mitigate any flood issues. Again, on HUD finance projects, this may very well trigger that 8-step process I referenced before. And again, we'll touch on that a little bit more, what that involves later on in the presentation. Next on the list, explosive and inflammable hazards. So this is these photos are a good example of demonstrating what that is and what that means. So this is a site that, as you can see, is right next to a bulk petroleum storage facility. And so when you're looking at explosive and inflammable hazards, financing agencies will generally not insure or may not insure a property where structures or residents will be exposed to unacceptable risks posed by the proximity to explosive or flammable hazards. This means that for new construction projects or rehabilitation projects where unit density is increased, or where there is a conversion from non-residential to residential use, or where a vacant building is made habitable, there must be what's identified as acceptable separation distance away from an above-ground storage facility with explosive, combustible, or flammable material contents or similar industrial facilities. Depending on the specific circumstances, like I said, that includes what's in those tanks and what their potential for, whether or not they're flammable, combustible, explosive. So a number of those circumstances and the distance from any of the buildings or planned buildings, you know, this will affect the ability of the project to get approval and or close with that agency. So again, knowing up front who's involved and assessing this as part of that initial due diligence will be important as you are preparing your application for submittal. Threatened and endangered species. What this is basically reviewing your site, that whether or not your project may have an effect on endangered or threatened species or their habitat. This evaluation is going to look at, again, whether or not those actual species that are threatened or endangered are present, or if their habitats are present. And it can take a few weeks to do this assessment. It typically is going to include a desktop review of available information to determine, you know, the extent of habitat of potential species of concern, and a site visit to document the presence of these species and or their respective habitats. This is a good example of that right here. You have a photo of a site, and specifically what's important about this photo is that the ash juniper trees in the picture were the habitat for 2 species of birds that were on the threatened and endangered species list. And it was important to document where all these trees were, provide a map, and so that shows the extent of it, which is the other image on the slide. So that way the developer could know whether or not they would have to mitigate this in any way as part of their project. And so based on the findings of, you know, your assessment, you may have mitigation that, again, could be in form of site plan alteration, building away from those habitats, or scheduling your construction to accommodate the migratory or mating habits of that species of concern. So those are some things to consider. And again, you know, 3 to 4 weeks is likely what you have to consider from a time budget standpoint to be able to get something like this evaluated appropriately.
Hey, Derek, has there been any in your findings? Has there been any? What's the most unusual endangered species or threatened species that you've come across that have shut down a development?
Oh, I mean, like one up here recently, and I'll touch on this before, was the rusty patch bumblebee. Obviously with, you know, the, I guess people more aware of pollinators and what they provide and the value they have in the ecosystems, you know, that's a big one. And so having a site that had potential for rusty patch bumblebee habitat means they're going to have to look at how they're doing their development and if that's going to impact, you know, again, when the bumblebee actually is at the height of when they're out and about doing their thing, pollinating, so it may affect their ability to actually, when they can sequence construction. So I don't think that, you know, you're going to get to a point where it's going to completely shut down a job site, but it's going to put up some speed bumps along the way that are going to have to be mitigated or, you know, planned ahead for, because again, it will affect how things progress and may affect you know, the duration of a project, which, as we all know in development, that can be a big dollar hit to a project. So, all right, and then I touched on these when I talked about the phase one. So, you know, we're going to touch on a few things that may be considered business risk items in a standard phase one, but not necessarily required to be covered in a standard phase one. The first is asbestos containing materials. You know, I guess as most people may think asbestos is banned, not a problem, don't have to consider it, but contrary to what actually is out there, asbestos is technically not banned. Only some forms of it and some products are banned. So regardless of age of your property structures, some level of asbestos evaluation is going to be required at a minimum, generally targeting the materials to be disturbed by any rehab project. Several states actually specify that regardless of age, a building needs to be inspected for asbestos prior to any renovation. And again, if it's an older property, let's say prior to 1985, it's likely going to be more comprehensive than something that's built within the last 5-10 years. But this does include the collection of samples, so it is a fairly intrusive exercise. And again, can take 2 to 3 weeks to do an inspection and report on that with the results. And that's assuming access agreements and PAs allow for accessing and doing the intrusive sampling and testing that's needed. So it's, you know, it becomes a challenge when you have, especially now in our COVID situation, accessing apartment units with occupied residents, because again, everybody's concerns, and it's very well warranted right now. But you know, to be able to access a representative number of units and sample representative materials to be able to help you demonstrate that indeed no asbestos is going to be disturbed during, or that no asbestos is present or going to be disturbed, you know, that will require some level of intrusive access. Thanks. Jim?
Derek, as far as asbestos, I guess what you're talking about is related to acquisition, rehab. How do you have to deal with it if it's new construction? Let's say you have a demolition of existing structures to make the project move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So even with, you know, obviously if you're looking at buying a site that has existing structures, that also is going to require your due diligence to inspect for asbestos prior to demolition. That's going to be a requirement in most states as well, to identify if asbestos is in a building to be demolished and getting it removed prior to demolition in accordance with regs. So yeah, new construction, you know, where you have a existing building on a site that you're tearing down, asbestos is going to be an issue. Acquisition of an existing building, depending on age, you know, regardless of age, actually, you still may need to consider that. You know, Texas is a good example of that, where most cities won't actually issue the building permits until they see an asbestos inspection to demonstrate that no asbestos is present. So that's definitely something that needs to be you know, need to be aware of as you are planning your project. And then next on that list, oh, go ahead, Lance.
There was and I know I'm speaking in Texas, but was there a specific year, like if it was prior to 1980, you have to have an asbestos test, but if a building was built after a certain time, you don't, or is that just city by city?
No. No, actually, it's a good question. So, and that's where I think there's out in kind of the public sphere, that's still maybe some confusion. I think people assume, if your building was built in the 80s or earlier or newer, that asbestos isn't an issue. And unfortunately, there was efforts in the 80s to ban all uses of asbestos, and that was actually overturned by the appeals court. And so, like I said, there's only, I think, six types of asbestos uses that asbestos is banned in. You can still actually find it in building materials being imported today. There are still countries that are actively mining asbestos, and there are materials that you can find with it. One story early in my career I like to point out, which I think kind of highlights this, is that we had an inspector going out to sample a roof for asbestos. And on their way to the job site, they stopped by the local hardware store, picked up a bucket of roof patch so they could patch their sample locations. And what they didn't recognize was they had just patched the roof, which the roof itself turned out to be non-asbestos, but they had just applied an asbestos patch to the roof that they just tested. So, it's still out there, it's still an issue. So because of that, most states are telling you, regardless of age, you need to inspect prior to any renovation. Now, there are actually some states and counties that have gone so far as to say you need to have an asbestos report that's dated less than a year from your renovation to be able to proceed. So that means if you did an inspection of a building in 2015, but you're going to be renovating the building in 2021 next year, you're going to need to have an inspection report that has a date that's less than a year from the start of your renovation, regardless if you've already tested your building. So it's still an issue out there. Hopefully by now, most people think we've gotten rid of most of it, but there's still kind of that documentation piece that you need to demonstrate that you didn't install something or that someone didn't install something that had asbestos.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Next on that list, which kind of go hand in hand with asbestos, is lead-based paint. Lead-based paint is a little bit more clear-cut because it was actually banned for use. So if your property was built in 1978 or later, you don't need to consider lead-based paint, and there would be no evaluation for it. Hard stop right there, you're done, move on. Unfortunately, though, if your building was built prior to 1978, or if you have, if you're, for instance, an existing apartment building that's an older construction, or if you have a building you're converting from non-residential to residential, you need to do evaluation for lead-based paint. And the scope of that assessment or investigation could vary greatly depending on the scope of the rehab and the financing requirements. This could include a combination of a full lead-based paint inspection, which is a surface by surface, room by room evaluation for the presence of lead-based paint, or a lead risk assessment, which is targeted at assessing for lead hazards, which could be paint in poor shape, or elevated lead dust, or lead in soil that could be an issue, or a combination of both. Those assessments can take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the level of evaluation needed, and again, assuming access agreements, PA, and purchase agreements that allow for accessing units and testing. Generally, it can be a little less intrusive. There's, sampling is done either with dust wipes of a surface, or, for instance, at Braun Tech, we use what's called an XRF analyzer, which is a handheld analyzer that you use to shoot, we call it shoot, painted surfaces, and it tells you right there if the surface contains lead above the standard. Other methods for doing that would be actually taking paint chips, which would be more intrusive because you're actually cutting out a square of the painted surface. So again, depending on that, what's found there, the type of rehab being done, and the financing requirements, that would also inform what type of abatement of lead paint or lead hazards is going to be triggered for your project. Mold, fungal, and moisture damage. This is another one that, kind of asks the question, what's below the surface? Sometimes what you don't see doesn't tell the whole story. These photos are a good example of what you don't see doesn't tell the whole story. And so most financing agencies will require at a minimum a visual assessment as part of due diligence to determine if mold or fungal, potential is there, or if moisture damage is present that could indicate a potential for mold or fungal growth, and what the level of potential is there. And again, initially this is going to be only a visual assessment for indications of mold or moisture damage. No sampling is typically done in this. And then based on that, some agencies will trigger that, or will require that you prepare a mold and moisture management plan saying how the property staff will handle any mold or moisture concerns as part of the routine property maintenance. So now we're going to move into some of the case studies, kind of going through some recent projects and what was included, what was required to be done on top of the standard phase one. And as we talked about early on, that added time to the project. The first one I want to highlight here is a HUD-related case project. This was local here to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. It was a new construction project adjacent to a busy freeway. In addition to the standard phase one, because of HUD's involvement, it triggered us to review the HUD environmental assessment factors, which kind of is a list of additional items that touch on a lot of the things we talked about in this presentation. It included a wetland delineation, noise assessment and attenuation study. This site actually in this suburb was adjacent to a busy freeway, but it was also near the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. So you had a couple different noise factors to make sure weren't going to be a concern for the development. And then again, the rusty patch bumblebee issue I talked about previously with Lance on his question about that, had to kind of provide some information on that and whether or not the proposed development was going to be a significant impact to the rusty patch bumblebee habitat. And then as part of a HUD assessment, we have to do the HERO submission, which is HUD's online environmental review tool, where once we do all these assessment factors and identify all that, then it's working with the developer and their HUD lender, to upload this to the HUD HEROes site for submission. And then I want to jump back up to, I know I skipped that, the HUD 8-step process. So that was where that was also triggered on this project because of the wetland. And so I want to touch on what that all involves. Again, it's an 8-step process, and literally because there are 8 steps that have to be followed. So the objective of the 8-step analysis is to evaluate alternatives to developments affecting wetlands and floodplains and publish 2 public notices. The general scope of work will be to analyze the potential impacts of the proposed project to a local floodplain or wetland located within the proposed project area. So you generally includes a floodplain analysis in accordance with the HUD 8-step protocol, and that's to comply with federal floodplain management requirements. If there are concerns raised by HUD officials that will require additional work beyond that, that's when we'll have to kind of get involved and do more detailed analysis. But the 8 steps included in that 8-step process are determining if the floodplain and wetland locations, and then second step is that first public notice. So this is required to be published for 15 days, and there's comments from the public on that will also be received by HUD in that 15-day period. So again, looking at timeframes and how that affects your ability to submit your financing package and so on. The third step is evaluating alternatives that need to be considered for your project. 4 is analyzing the potential impacts to any, to the project from floodplain issues or wetlands. 5 is identifying potential mitigation measures. 6 is reevaluating any of the alternatives that were identified. 7 is determination of the preferred alternative and publishing the public notice of decision. So this is that final notice that's saying, hey, we determined the alternatives and what our decision is. That has to be published for 7 days, and then the public will have an opportunity then to submit and comment and provide comments to HUD regarding this project during that period. And then your final step is implementing the proposed action. So again, it can be a lengthy process, or but again, planning up front, having the right team involved on this can help kind of that process go smooth. Just kind of a
sorry, real quick question. What about we really haven't talked about it, but I would thought that it would be a bigger an issue. But what about vapor investigations, or is that an issue, or is that just not a stipulation?
No, I think vapor is going to be a little bit, vapor is something to consider, and that's, typically with the general phase one, we kind of comment on vapor, potential for vapor, just kind of from a high level based on surrounding properties and what their uses are, and if there was, on-site and off-site, if there was potential for vapor. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but yeah, you're right, that is something you have to consider, and that would trigger a phase two assessment to determine what is actually there from a vapor or contamination standpoint. For instance, kind of that last bullet on this slide, there was a gas station nearby, and so this triggered us to do a phase two environmental site assessment on the site as well, to determine that indeed that gas station wasn't going to be an issue. There were no subsurface impacts that were a result of that gas station having underground storage tanks for petroleum projects. So that, so looking at that would include looking at soil contamination, but also soil vapor as an issue. So next I want to touch on some projects that were done in the state of Texas, had the involvement of the TDHCA. I have actually 4 projects listed here, 2 in Austin, 1 in Midland, and 1 in Houston. I just kind of quickly want to run through what we ended up having to do in addition to a standard assessment. So the first project, Austin, Texas, existing community with an expansion area. This was actually the photo I showed you for the endangered species of the ash juniper trees. It required a wetland delineation and also a review of endangered species and the trees that were there as the habitat, to evaluate the extent of that habitat, as well as how that might affect the project. So that was the first one. The second one in Austin was a new construction site adjacent to a busy freeway. This one also had a wetland delineation. It was undeveloped. Actually, it was developed with just some like homestead properties or farmstead properties, but triggered a wetland delineation due to the features on site and the full noise assessment and attenuation study due to the freeway that was right along the property boundary. So those are kind of shows you 2 examples of 2 different projects and kind of the things that we had to include in our assessment for the due diligence. The third project I want to touch on was in Midland, Texas. It was a new construction, undeveloped site that actually had a pipeline traversing through the center of the site. So what actually was triggered was a evaluation of the pipeline and a review of its contents and what type of setbacks, I should say, that were going to be required for the development. And so the assessment was done in accordance with the pipeline and informed planning analysis guidance, which is called PIPA. And so that was done to determine, like I said, if the planned development meets the PIPA guidelines for development around pipelines, and evaluation of the pipeline contents and what those appropriate setbacks for buildings and features might need to be in order to be in compliance there. So that was something that we had to provide to TDHCA as well. Lastly, the last project, again, Houston, Texas, existing community adjacent to the freeway and a bulk petroleum facility. Again, back to that photos I have of the explosive and flammable substances. Again, busy freeway triggered a noise assessment to demonstrate that the existing apartment buildings were, that the noise levels were appropriate. But then also doing that flammable and explosive hazard evaluation to determine that the setbacks or separation distance was appropriate based on the type of chemicals and petroleum products that were in those tanks. So what each of these examples demonstrates is the type of additional assessment items that may be required during the due diligence phase in order to meet the state housing requirements. Each of these can add time that may have not been considered during initial site selection and could delay submission of your financing application or even rejection of the application as incomplete. So that's kind of the point what I wanted to kind of get across about these 4 sites and all of these actually. Next, I want to jump over to Georgia. I got a couple here to talk about. Again, Georgia DCA, and a lot of this may seem like repetitive, but again, it's just to stress the importance of understanding that there are things that are going to be needed to be added to your assessment and your due diligence that you need to consider, and that adds a time factor, and not appropriate understanding of that could delay submission of that financing package. First site was Atlanta suburb, new construction adjacent to a busy freeway. This one was a little bit more complicated. We had to do the assessment, but also the attenuation study. And at first glance, there's an existing noise wall there. And so at first thought, you're like, well, that should be fine. But unfortunately, due to the planned development, the height of the buildings actually exceeded the height of the sound wall. And so what ended up, when we did our noise assessment, we were getting elevated noise over the acceptable levels for those upper floors that were taller than the sound wall, at least the planned upper floors. And so that required to do an attenuation study, but then also we put together this figure that showed basically at what point on the site are the noise levels above the unacceptable range. And so you can see in the red area on the figure, that was kind of within that zone would be considered unacceptable from a noise standpoint. So we provided that to developers so they can maybe tweak their building layouts, so maybe build outside of that zone to kind of make it easier to get approval for the project. Again, that also affected outdoor amenities such as courtyards, play areas, things like that. Next one in Georgia, again, another Atlanta suburb. This was a new construction. It was just a big undeveloped wooded hill or, piece of property. This one we completed the cultural and historic resource review and evaluation. That was what was significant about this one specifically. That was the added item that had required a little bit more work. And so again, this was triggered by the Georgia DCA. And what was identified in that review was an abandoned railroad track and then a house adjacent to the site that was deemed significant. And so then it required those features to be documented. Which that documentation included what you see here is a placard that had to be placed on the development regarding the historic railroad track. But then also a historical write-up on the house that was going to be documented, so that way if anything ever happened, they had that write-up completed. So that's, again, unique situation, something that you wouldn't expect that would be required as part of an environmental assessment or due diligence activities, but just kind of highlighting that fact. Again, took some time to do that, had to get the assessment done and to identify these features and then come up with what these documentation pieces were going to look like. Arizona Department of Housing. So I got two sites here. These I'll be a little quicker, but again, two sites, both new construction, one in Mesa, one in Phoenix. The Mesa one sticks out to me as funny about that first bullet about a wetland evaluation. It's Arizona. You wouldn't expect there to be many wetlands to begin with. Just kind of, it's a desert, right? Well, what the issue here was there was a drainage ditch along the property boundary, and as I mentioned before about the NWI online mapper, that really, because that is looking at aerial photographs for potential wetland features, that drainage ditch was actually identified as a potential wetland feature. So, because of that, it required us to kind of look at, while not requiring a full delineation, doing a little bit more evaluation of what that is, and to document and demonstrate to the Arizona Housing Group that this was not a wetland, it was just a drainage ditch. So why, on the face of it, you're like, it's a drainage ditch, but to be able to document that appropriately so that way it gets signed off on by the agency, it required some additional work and review to do that. And then we also had to do a cultural and historic resource review of the site, again, to document are there any significant historical or archaeological features or structures that may have been on the site. The City of Phoenix site, new construction, And what I want to point out here is that while there was a cultural historic resource review component, it was actually the city of Phoenix that was driving an archaeological review of this site in order to give planning approval. So the city of Phoenix has actually got a pretty robust program around that, and so they require you to go through an archaeological review with the city archaeology office to determine that your site does not have any significant features that may be impacted by a development. So this is the last date I want to talk about, and so I just want to summarize this with saying that most state housing finance agencies have similar requirements for additional items that need to be evaluated during your due diligence. But it's with the minor nuances and how they want this information and presented and documented that can get confusing, and if you don't understand them can kind of be a struggle and make it a little bit more challenging. The bottom line is that if there are federal or state housing finance agency involvement, there are going to be additional items that need to be reviewed or evaluated as part of your due diligence. So with that, I want to kind of touch on radon now. And I left radon kind of toward the end because this is something that kind of crosses all state, federal housing authority and agencies, financing agencies. They all require some level of radon testing as part of due diligence. But it's important to point out that conventional financing, they also require it. Generally, the testing is done prior to closing on your site, and this would be mainly for existing properties. For new construction, there is not going to be a radon testing requirement because you have no buildings to test. But and I'll touch on that too, but there will be post-construction testing that will likely be triggered. And that's going to be for acquisition of existing properties, but also new construction. And so depending on, and that may be just testing done at the end of the project to demonstrate the radon levels are acceptable, or if mitigation is triggered, you'll need to do testing anyway after mitigation to demonstrate that the mitigation is doing what it's supposed to do. And that's going to need to, prior to closing out the project with that financing agency, they're going to want to see those results. But then for new construction, it's important that, to make sure that the design team evaluates the state or local building codes to ensure that the development includes the appropriate radon risks to construction. Again, the testing is going to be intrusive just because you are required to access a fair number of units. And in some instances, we're talking 100% of ground contact unit plus 25% of upper level units on each floor. So again, that can be a fairly sizable amount of units you have to access. And at this, knowing with the COVID situation, that also can complicate things with access. But then knowing those requirements up front, again, is going to help determine that level of testing needed. Time frame for radon testing. The short-term testing is something that's done. It's usually a 48 to 72 hour time frame, assuming access. But if long-term testing is triggered based on those results, that could take 90 days or 90 plus days to complete long-term testing. Again, regardless of the financing, radon testing should be considered to evaluate the risk and associated impact of having to install a mitigation system. Mitigation systems can have a significant cost impact to your project, and knowing that up front obviously is important. Again, mitigation though will trigger post-installation testing of radon. And so kind of going back to Lance's point about vapor, vapor and radon are very similar in that, you're evaluating the potential for intrusion of either radon gas or soil vapor gas into your building. And, if you have an adjoining gas station with a leak, if your site used to be have a former history of industrial use or chemical use or petroleum product use, and you have a potential for vapor intrusion, and you find that out during testing, you have vapor impacts, you may need to consider vapor mitigation. And so a vapor mitigation system may be very similar to a radon system. You're basically providing a pathway for vapors or radon to get from below your building and out of your building and not into your building. So those may also be something that will have to be evaluated in addition to just the general soil and groundwater contamination that might be identified as a concern in a phase 1 ESA. And so just to kind of recap, knowing those requirements up front, the environmental requirements up front for a proposed project will allow your consultant to complete the appropriate assessment activities and minimize delays and hurdles for your project approval. So choosing a consultant with the experience, knowledge, and resources to address these is going to be critical. Additional financing specific items will add time and cost to your due diligence process. So adding an experienced, multidisciplinary consultant to your team is key. A consultant that has these expertise and resources will help streamline the timing and reduce costs and help ensure a successful project outcome and allow you to get that financing package submitted when you need. A consultant with that diverse group of specialists to address all these additional requirements, including the environmental professionals, the natural resource specialists, asbestos, lead, and radon professionals, is important. In addition, on a new development project, having a consultant that has the engineering side, the geotechnical side, that capability as well, that can improve efficiencies and timing as well, which can also provide further savings on your overall project costs. It's important to note, though, that again, having that experienced team can provide a smooth, seamless transition when you go from your assessment activities into any remediation that might be needed during development. So I want to thank everybody for their time. If you have any questions, obviously, as Lance said, in the chat window, otherwise feel free to, there are contact information, reach out to us. We'd be happy to.
Derek, I do have a couple of questions from the audience right now. If we're running close to time. Okay. If a site has a no further action letter, would a housing agency such as HUD require a phase 2?
It can depend. Depends on how old that is and if the phase 1 might identify a new issue that may have to be reevaluated. But again, what we're finding out now, especially for Minnesota, but other states, an NFA from 5-10 years ago may not have addressed soil vapor. That soil vapor has been a kind of a hot button issue that's been brought to the forefront in the last probably 5 years. So an old NFA, while that will maybe give the lender a level of comfort on soil or groundwater, it may not have addressed vapor, which then would trigger some additional phase 2 to evaluate that issue.
Okay, and then this one,
which that could lead into possible mitigation. So
okay, this one's a little lengthy, but do the standards require that environmental contamination identified in a phase 2 be resolved in the sense that regulatory closure must be demonstrated before financing will be considered? Or is it sufficient that the impact has been identified and a response action plan be prepared so that the regulatory closure can be accomplished during the project construction?
Yeah, I think I'll let Steve answer that one.
Sure, that's a great question. I think, the latter part of the question is kind of answering it. Basically, when you're in your due diligence process, you're going to be working through identifying the problem, potential contamination through the phase 2. If you find one, what HUD is going to typically want to see is that you work through the investigation to find the problem, develop a cleanup or a response action plan to address the issue. Get approval of that cleanup plan from your state agency, then that usually is sufficient to move forward with the project financing or the firm application, and then you'll implement that plan during construction, which is always the most cost-effective way to do it. And then once the plan has been implemented, you'll ultimately get a final sign-off from your regulatory agency that will be provided to the lender. Usually prior to occupancy, but sometimes once construction is complete and occupancy is completed.
Well, great. Well, excellent webinar, guys. A lot of great information. Thank you, Derek and Steve. And if you have extra questions down the road, the contact information, feel free to reach out to them, or you can also reach out to me on the email that I'm going to send out to you probably later tomorrow. But thank you guys for your time and all of the hard work. It does take a lot to do these webinars, so I appreciate the effort. So, and then if you guys want to hit our next webinar next month, it's on SPCC's plans, protecting your inventory and managing your liability, and that's going to be with Jill Mickelson and Josh. Oh my goodness, what is it? Cadmus?
Josh Cadmus.
Cadmus. Okay, I didn't want to butcher that too much, but thank you for attending our webinar here, and we'll check you next time. Thanks, Derek and Steve. Again, appreciate your time.
Thanks, Lance.
All right, have a great day.